Hi, my name is Dr. Caleb Carr. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about nonverbal communication. In communication courses, we spend a lot of time talking about verbal communication, the messages that we say. But we don't spend as much time talking about nonverbal communication, which actually comprises a lot more of our communication content than verbal communication. McCornack defines nonverbal communication as intentional or unintentional transmission of meaning through individuals' non-spoken, physical, or behavioral cues. This definition gives us a good look into what constitutes and what doesn't constitute nonverbal communication. Specifically, we can look at phrases such as intentional or unintentional transmission, in that nonverbal messages can be either purposeful and specifically done, which we often see in things like professional orations and public speaking, or unintentional, the little subconscious gestures that we give off when interacting with individuals in our daily lives. Specifically today, we're going to look at two types of nonverbal communication: proxemics and chronemics. We'll begin with proxemics. Proxemic deals with the use of space and spatial orientation in interactions. And we see that space can be used to create, particularly deal with the environment of the communication context in which one encounters. We see space used in our daily lives, and how far people stand from each other when they talk can change the nature of that interaction. Think of a time you've been talking with a close friend. How far away did you stand? In the United States, our proxemic distances are relatively structured, so that anything from 0 to about 18 inches, a foot and a half, is what's labeled intimate space. These are a defining feature of close relationships, those that we're comfortable with being within about 18 inches of us. These can include things like spouses, significant others, family members, or our children. We're very comfortable everything from actual touch, holding, to something just being nearby them or having them whisper to us. Between 18 inches and about 4 feet is what we refer to as personal space. This personal space is what is obviously less close than our intimate space with our friends, but it's still close enough that we feel like we're interacting with someone. We see this personal space manifest most often in interactions with our friends. So as you talk with someone, a classmate perhaps, or an instructor after class, you're not standing so close as to be breathing on them, but close enough to recognize that you are in a dyadic interpersonal exchange. Between 4 feet and 12 feet, we see what's defined as social space. And this social space we use for things like workplace communications, communications with acquaintances, or strangers that we may be having an interaction with but may not be terribly interpersonal or meaningful to us. So, as you see a stranger walking through the campus and you wave to them and say hello, but you don't physically move towards one another. This indicates some sort of relationship, but not so close as to stop and progress towards each other. Not just the time. Now, not stopping will deal with chronemics, which we'll get to in a moment, but rather not moving towards each other will address the proxemics of your communication. Finally, 12 feet and greater, we can talk about public space. And in this public space, we see it used most often for things like formal occasions, such as speeches or public lectures. And this is often used to actually establish a distance. The first thing we talk about coming close together. In public spaces, we talk about forming a distance between the speaker and the audience. And this is used to acknowledge that we are still in the same communication context, such as giving a public speech, but not so close as to actually draw closer to one another. We often see that the use of proxemics is highly influenced by culture. Through the 4 spaces we just gave, 0 to 18 inches with intimate space, 18 inches to 4 feet with personal space, 4 to 12 feet with social space, and 12 feet and greater with public space. We see those as very United States and Americanized numbers. As you travel around the globe, you may find these proxemics will change. For example, in Latin America, those numbers will get much closer together, and even something social space may occur within just a foot or two. Whereas in Japanese or Chinese cultures, personal space and your personal bubble, as they say, is much greater, and it's actually considered rude to be very close to someone, even in a more intimate and close relationship. One of the most common places we see proxemics applied outside of public speaking is in interpersonal interactions. And in fact, we see the location and orientation of individuals taking a large play in how we communicate with each other. Think of your dorm room. Even when you're not in your dorm room, you think of that as your space. And in fact, if you come in and see your roommate going through your drawers, through your computer, or just sitting at your desk or on your bed, you say, hey, you're in my space. Even though you didn't actually occupy it, because of a notion known as territoriality. In territoriality, we feel a personal connection with a physical space and seek to protect it, to own that space as if it's ours. Not just your clothing or computer, but your actual space, even when you're not occupying it. And this territoriality is an offshoot of the idea of proxemics. In addition to the use of space, we can often communicate nonverbally through use of time, and this is an area known as chronemics. In chronemics, we look at how individuals organize, perceive, and then use their time as a tool for nonverbal communication. Chronemics can change both within cultures and between cultures, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But it tends to be established by that culture's social norms. So one may talk about the chronemics of the United States versus African country, but one may also talk about the chronemics of Midwest United States versus East Coast. And these are both valid because the social norms of those areas are going to be so very different. When we talk about chronemics, we can often talk about two types of time orientations: an M-type orientation or a P-type orientation. The M-type orientation for time is monochromic, in that we sense we should be doing one thing at a time, everything at its time and everything in its place. Time is perceived as something that can be spent, should be conserved and protected, or can be wasted. Individuals with an M-type orientation very much value scheduling. They value time management. They seek to follow their planners and do this at this time, followed by this at that time. We often do one thing at a time to better conserve and use that time, and when we're finished with one project, then move on to the next. When we're finished with one interaction, move on to the next interaction. In a P-time orientation, or a polychronic orientation, individuals don't see the sense of doing one thing at a time, and often will try to, or just naturally do, several things at a time, balance several projects, engage in several conversations. Unlike an M-time orientation, an individual with a polychronic organization will not view time as something that can be spent, stored, or should be guarded. So you'll see individuals that often say, I'll get there when I can, which does not mean at a specific time, but rather once this project is finished. Or we'll have a conversation with multiple partners at the same time, not because any partner is getting less time or interest, but rather because the time can be split between them. In the United States, individuals typically have a M-time orientation. Even think about the class structure that you're in. You go to a specific classroom on specific days of the week at specific times. Rather than your instructor saying, hey, I'll be in this room for a couple hours today, stop on by when you can and we'll chat about stuff. When you get into the organizational world, we see oftentimes meetings are scheduled, deadlines are scheduled, even your workday is scheduled. Working 9 to 5 illustrates a degree of M-time orientation. As I mentioned, this can change by culture. This can change both by sort of within the organization or culture. So if you think of, again, Midwest time orientation versus an East Coast time orientation, where time is in the East Coast is much more protected, much more fast-paced. Whereas in the Midwest, we typically take a slightly slower pace of doing things and often can maybe do one or two things at a time. This can also expand across cultures. So again, broadly speaking, in the United States, we have a very M-time orientation versus things like the Arabian cultures, African cultures, Latino cultures, and the Caribbean cultures often really espouse a P-time orientation. Think of the individual walking through the islands and saying, I'll get to it when I get to it. It's not that they're not valuing and respecting your time, but rather their orientation of time is different. And it's important when dealing with others to keep in mind not only your own chronemic orientation, but also theirs. If they match up, there may not be too much of a need to address it directly. But particularly if there's a discongruency between individuals' chronemic orientation, you're going to need to take some time to think about what is the intended versus what is the unintentional meaning of how they've used time. And the same way with space as well. If someone's 15 minutes late for a meeting and comes up and hugs you, is this necessarily a violation of your social norms or the social norms of the culture from which they're drawing? These are all important things to consider when talking about nonverbal communication, and specifically proxemics, the discussion and use of distance as a non-communicative tool, as well as chronemics, the use of time as a non-verbal communicative tool. Thank you very much.